Okay, we are live. Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, everyone, according to where you are on this globe. We are at the Philosophical Cafe number 92, and we are going to talk about Descartes. But perhaps not about that philosopher, Descartes, that we all know, the father of early modern philosophy. The received view on Descartes is that Descartes was a sort of quintessential armchair philosopher. Somehow, someone who could find truth about the human nature or truth about the nature of things by reason alone. And he made a lot out of this, how we can learn a lot of things and build a whole system of philosophy starting from few principles and then somehow deducing from those few principles, guided by the principle of truth, which tells that things have to be clear and distinct and so on. We don't need that many experiments. Tonight we're going to talk about a different Descartes, someone who was spending very little time in an armchair. The young Descartes, traveling around Europe. He joined now one army, now the other. He was probably fighting. He had a keen eye for the European politics that was going on at the time. He tried a number of different professions, and apparently he fascinated a number of his contemporaries because there was always a little bit of mystery surrounding his actions. What was this young Descartes up to is what we are going to try to find out tonight. And we are going to start from a book, Harold Cook's book, The Young Descartes, which is a very good reading, and I'm recommending it to you all if you haven't read it yet. We are going to talk about it tonight a bit, and we are going to take it as a pretext for a larger discussion on the young Descartes and the mystery surrounding Descartes' biography. Joining me and Grigore tonight are Harold Cook, the author of the book, and Daniel Garber, leading expert on Cartesian studies. And I'm very glad that joining us on Zoom tonight, there are many other friends and colleagues who know a lot about Descartes, and together maybe we can reach some answers tonight, or at least we can clarify some questions and put them on the table for further discussion. We have also an audience on YouTube, and I'm very glad you are with us tonight. Welcome. We wait for your questions. This is a discussion, it's not a series of talks or statements. So everyone is welcome to join either directly by asking questions on Zoom, or if you are on YouTube, just type your question and I'm going to introduce it into the discussion. Let's talk a bit about our title, Descartes Musketeer. Harold Cook, Descartes was joining an army. What kind of guns would he carry with him? Was he literally a musketeer? You need to, yes, you need
yes,
to.
Sorry, hit the wrong button there for the microphone. So he was probably not very often trailing a musket, but he would have done that from time to time. And he was also very good at swordplay. But the kinds of muskets of the time were mostly firelocks, with some flintlocks being introduced. So this is the kind of difference in weaponry that was being introduced in the 17th century. And the firelock is the way of setting off the gunpowder in the weapon, which fires the bullet out the front of the gun. You set that gunpowder on fire by putting a burning ember of some kind. Usually this is a bit of string or rope that you would put by hand on the gun. Later on, there is a kind of trigger mechanism so that you can have your burning rope touch the gunpowder, which was more common in Descartes' time. And then by the middle of the century, 17th century, the flintlock is coming into common action. And that's what we usually think of when we're thinking of muskets, so that there's a piece of flint that strikes another piece of iron that sets off a spark, and the spark then sets off the gunpowder. So if you look at the steps that people were trained in, how you would learn to fire one of these weapons, some of the Dutch illustrators set out steps for learning how to fire a weapon effectively, and they amount to a dozen or 18 different steps that you have to take in order to fire and reload and be able to fire again. So it's a very complicated procedure.
This is a very good introduction for my next question. What was Descartes doing joining an army? Why would a young educated person in Europe looking for, I don't know, truth, we imagine, would join an army in 1618?
Well, so I think that the answer depends upon his background. And I think that the first thing to say is that military action was very common throughout Europe in the later 16th, early 17th century during his lifetime. It was a world full of conflict that included armed conflict, organized violence. One of the things that happens is that his early biographers tell us that he was involved in the beginnings of what became the 30 Years' War, which was so horrible that the number of people alive in Central Europe decreased. The birth rate couldn't keep up with the death rate. It was really a horrible period of time. So if you are of a certain rank in society, which we would talk about as maybe upper gentlemen, but also certainly nobles, the main thing that your job was to lead the fighting. And so if he's a young man looking for advancement in the world, today, people might go look for, getting into a corporation or becoming a CEO or being an entrepreneur. In his day, you find patrons who are in the court or associated with powerful positions in society, and many of those people will be involved in warfare. So I think it was a very common job, you might say, for young men interested in social advancement.
Even
and he comes from that kind of a family where his family was mostly lawyers, but with some pretensions to nobility, and some people in his family must have had some connections to warfare as well. So that's where he sees the future is making a name for himself in valor as well as in other aspects of life.
And because there was no war in France at that time, he was just moving where the war was, which is in Central Europe.
Yes. So at the moment when he goes to the Netherlands for the first time, 18, 19, in that period of time, he is said by his biographer Bayet to be learning the art of war. And the art of war is really military engineering. So, and the Netherlands had a reputation for teaching that very, very well. Many French engineers were trained in the Netherlands, as well as many other people. But the Dutch, the wars in the Low Countries, which were at the moment, there was a truce, but the wars in the Low Countries in the late 16th, early 17th century were known as places for the best study of war, where the wars were the most brutal, the most exacting, often by siege warfare, and the Dutch engineering was considered to be excellent. Also in northern Italy, but the Netherlands is where he went. And then off into the wars elsewhere. France later becomes full of warfare also, but he begins with his training by going abroad.
Then Garber, what do you think about philosopher? You have to.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to make a brief addition to what you said, how that absolutely military engineering was very important to Descartes. Military architecture was considered, and engineering was considered one of the mathematical sciences. And Descartes, I think, from the time he was in school, was, as he says, say in part one of the discourse on the method, he was enchanted by mathematics, and this was part of mathematics. The other sort of it was called mixed mathematics, what we might call applied mathematics. The other sciences being, optics, observational astronomy, music, all of which involved in some way or another mathematics as applied to particular problems. And I think that was also, this was his sort of apprenticeship in mathematics.
Right. And just to add to what you're saying, that kind of mixed mathematics you're talking about often involves instruments. And so I think this is also something you can see in his own mathematical approaches is the use of instruments and mathematical devices, let's say. So he's also learning how to use those very efficiently.
This is all good and well, and it sounds interesting and reasonable, but he spent a lot of time fighting and moving around Europe. So it wasn't a short apprenticeship into fortification, military engineering, after which he went home to do philosophy. Can you take us a bit through these first years of Descartes' life and tell us where he went? Of what?
Sure. I think maybe the easiest thing for me to do is to just share a map, if that's okay. So I will see if I can do that here. I'm opening system preferences. I'm sorry. Well, okay, so I'm not going to be able to do that very easily here, so I will just speak if that's all right. So you all can imagine the map of Europe. And so when he first goes to the Netherlands to learn the art of war, he's there at a period of time when the Emperor Ferdinand is being crowned the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. That's in September 1619. And after that, armies are raised for the empire to defeat an uprising, as they see it, in Hungary, and in Prague, Bohemia. And so this inaugurates the beginnings of what's called the 30 Years' War. He is involved with the Imperial Army. About a year later, he is in Ulm in Germany, where there is a French delegation sent to try to create a peace. That doesn't work very well. He then follows the Imperial Army further into Eastern Europe, He's at the Battle of White Mountain, this famous battle outside of Prague. And a year later, he's at a battle at Nové Zámky, or Neuhasel, which is a defeat for the imperial forces. At that time, he retreats to the north through Poland, to the Baltic, and spends some time there, and then makes his way back to the Netherlands by traveling west along the Baltic coast. After spending some time then looking at sieges in the Netherlands and then going back to France, he is involved in the beginnings of the French wars in Italy in the 1620s. Whether he is actually involved in the fighting there or just an observer or somehow participating in events at a distance is probably he's keeping a bit of an arm's length distance, but he's in the regions where there's another war happening. And then he comes back into France, spends a couple of years in Paris, and then there is the great siege of La Rochelle, where he is also involved, probably, but at least it is said by his biographers that he was present at the ceremonial capture of La Rochelle at the end of the 1620s. And then he goes to the Netherlands, which is where he spends his time, as we would think of it, writing philosophy. By that time, he's well into his 30s. And so he begins writing philosophy only at a, let's call it, mature age. And in all those decades beforehand, he is associated with court and with armies.
And he doesn't seem to have a position in this kind of wars. These are wars of religion. Descartes being at the beginning part of a Protestant army and then part of a Catholic army reminded me of that famous character in Alexandre Dumas, the Three Musketeers. I think one of the valets, Planchet, was the one whose father baptized one child Protestant Huguenot and the other one Catholic, and they were kind of robbing people together. And when the passersby were Catholic, then the Protestant would take the lead, and when the passersby were Protestants, then the Catholic would take the lead. Descartes seems to have been like that, or which is a sort of unbelievable if we think that these people were fighting, Protestants and Catholics were fighting each other. How could you switch side? How could you join now an army, then the other? Was that something that people did at the time?
So people did that at the time. I think in Descartes' case, he comes from a family from Poitiers and Châtellerault in France, where there were equal amounts of Huguenots, Protestants, and Catholics at the end of the 16th century, and where the Edict of Nantes is introduced, which gives Protestants civil rights in France. So I think that in his upbringing, he is working with family members who are trying to balance the religious parties, let's say. His education is with Catholics, and I think he has a Catholic kind of orientation, and many of the people he meets later in life are bishops of the Catholic Church, cardinals even in the Catholic Church, so he has very high-placed Catholic patrons. But I think also in his upbringing is much discussion about what people would now, at the time, call libertinism, but philosophies of nature that included Epicureanism coming from Lucretius and those sorts of things. So I think what he's looking for is a kind of solution to the religious problems that lies in natural philosophy, you might say, and that his orientation towards this, I'm speculating here, many of you are philosophers who will know this much better than me, but my view is that he is adopting a view of natural philosophy that is sympathetic with a certain reform effort inside the church that in the end is not accepted. And that in France gets expressed as Jansenism, which becomes a minority view within the Catholic Party in France.
Yes, Dan, please.
Thank you. Can I just make another comment on that? A different perspective on that. I mean, Descartes certainly, you're absolutely right. He certainly was from an area where they were mixed, where Catholics and Protestants were mixed. And in fact, Richard Watson, a Cartesian scholar, who wrote a very interesting kind of biography of Descartes, suggests that Descartes actually may have had Protestant sympathies, may have actually considered himself sort of a crypto-Protestant. But another element of it is if you think of this as his sort of mathematical apprenticeship, he'll go where where it is that he can learn something, as you pointed out, and less. I think his commitment to the armies was less ideological than it was very practical. And the Dutch were, as you said, very sophisticated engineers, and he knew that by hooking up with a Moritz of Nassau, he could learn something that he might not be able to learn elsewhere.
We have a question coming from our YouTube listeners, and this is a moment to remind everyone that this is a discussion and that you can join anytime. Emanuela Shoimu is asking on YouTube whether Descartes was really an ordinary soldier. Was it fighting in the first line?
So he says at one point that he did once take a silver coin for service. That suggests he was at one point in all of these connections a paid soldier. However, I think it's unlikely that he did this for much of his time. From what I can gather, he is mostly working for, let's call it, the officer staff, rather than serving at the front line carrying a musket, although he may have done that at one point. I think that his training as a military engineer may have got him towards the front line, close to the front line, maybe involved in the action more than once. And so he tells a story in one of his philosophical writings about how a soldier felt like he had been wounded, and that when the armor was taken off, he feels relief, the pain goes away. So I think that sounds like a personal experience. And I think at the last battle he's a part of, at Novi Zamki, where the imperial forces were defeated, that was a great disaster for the imperial forces. And very few people survived. He comes back to Bratislava with some Walloon troops, French-speaking from the Low Countries. And so I think he was part of a kind of escape group from that disaster. So I think he had real experience of fighting, but how much, and probably wearing some form of armor for some of that time, as people on horseback would do, certainly, and some of the soldiers on foot also.
Tell us who are the enemies in that defeat. Who was he? Who was
So-
the Imperial Army fighting with?
So in that defeat, it was Bethlen, who's the leader of the Hungarian troops, and they were very good at cavalry. So they were kind of surrounding the imperial troops who were besieging a city, and the Hungarian troops coming from the countryside, you might say, on horseback, made it impossible for the imperial troops to stay there. And in one of these actions outside that city, the commander of the imperial troops is killed. And after that, the imperial troops try to retreat. And that's when everything goes wrong. And Descartes survives. So I think he had a close call.
How should we imagine a battle in those times? Two masses of people fighting chaotically with swords, with muskets, and so on.
Yes, that would happen in open battle, let's call it, which did happen, where we imagine armies lined up on a field, on opposite sides of a field and attacking one another. More common in those days were sieges. So the siege is where if you imagine an early modern city, the best cities were very well fortified with very thick walls. And then there would be moats or water works on the outside of those walls, again, to try to prevent an attack. And if cannon fire is aimed at the walls were meant to be sloped so that the cannon fire would not damage the walls too much. So extremely expensive defensive works. The offense was to try to either starve out that place. That happened at La Rochelle. The forces of the king kept that city under siege for more than a year. Even though it had access to water, they cut that off by making an artificial dam to stop any boats from bringing food to the city. Something like 20-30% of the population of the city survived that, just from being starved to death, mostly. And you could also attack the walls. So there were various sieges where walls were attacked. And you can imagine some of these actions are not just with cannonballs that are solid, but cannonballs that would burst in air. So there were things like we now think of when we think of throwing grenades or having exploding shells in the air. So these were really horrifying battles, and he as a military engineer would have been one of the people helping to direct what was going on if he was involved in these battles, as I think he must have been.
You are making a good case in your book, Harold Cook, that this is a very costly way if you just want to learn mixed mathematics. And maybe Descartes had other purposes in mind as well for doing this. So what was he up to?
So I think that he was interested in scaling the social ladder, you might say, and that would mean making himself well known for valor and his military engineering, but to attract patrons among princely people. Princes, and even maybe the King of France. The illustration on the cover of my book was found by Alexander Marr a few years ago and identified as Descartes. I think he's correct in that, which is why I used that painting, which is by Simone Vouet. It's a pastel sketch, is how it's described. Pastels being a new kind of artistic method in the early 17th century. And before Marr identified it as Descartes, it was simply a young man with a collar at the court of Louis XIII. So Many of the people around Louis XIII of France were painted like this. That suggests that if Descartes is the person in this painting, he was at the court of Louis XIII. I think he was also looking for patronage in earlier days at the court of Marie de Medici. It's when her first minister and probable lover, Concini, was assassinated by Louis XIII to take over from his mother. I mean, that's how he moved against his mother, was to kill off her lover and first minister and to take over that way. She was shocked, as you can imagine. And people around her who were very close to her fled. That's when he goes back home to live with his father for a few months and then goes to the Netherlands to learn the art of war.
Before entering into the complexities of 17th century French politics, I'd like to ask some questions about the sources of your information. What are the early biographies of Descartes that we know of, and how credible they are?
Very important question. And one way of thinking about how I approached this study of the young Descartes was to start with Baillet. Baillet is a biographer from the end of the 17th century who was kind of brought in to write this biography by a series of people who before Baillet had been collecting stories about Descartes and materials related to Descartes, many of which have since disappeared. So I think that Baillet's biography is the best informed that we have from the time. Other things have been added by other biographers in years later, but I thought starting with something close to Descartes' own time would be the best place to begin. And then to start looking into both the places that are mentioned, so geography is important. Also the names, just trying to sort through the names. Who are these people who are mentioned in the biography? Does it make sense that he could have known these people or been in those places? And the other thing I was trying to do was sort out timelines. So where he would have been at this place at that moment, what else was happening? And so I just tried to start with this. I should say, recently there's a new edition of this biography by Baillet, put out by Annie Bitbull Hesperides. So there's, and she has added many notes to this new edition of Baillet as well, just recently out, I think last summer. And so he is, Baillet is drawing on the work, biographical work of other people as well, but also writing just after another important moment in French politics, which is the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. So this is when Louis XIV has come to the height of his power in France and revokes the civil rights for Huguenots. So I think also that Baillet is it has some political problems with this biography, which is how to make Descartes acceptable in a very conservative moment in France also. So it's not simply accepting Baillet's story, but trying to work with it and to especially work with the names mentioned by Baillet, to work outward from there, see what their connections might be, and to develop another sense of the, let's call it personal networks that he could have been involved in, that are first mentioned by Baillet, but moving on from there. Adam and Tannery, the great early 20th century compilation of Descartes' work. Adam also does important work, and there's many more modern biographers, including Dan Garber here, who's done wonderful work on all of that as well. So I don't pretend to be the only biographer. It's interesting that Descartes gets so much attention from biographers, but just to try to recreate the early life, which is much less documented from his own writings, because we just have a few letters from that period, nothing else from him.
Dan, would you like to intervene?
Thank you very much for that kind remark, Al. I think it's interesting. What you said at the very end is absolutely right. We at the moment have no serious documentation, or very little documentation, from before about 1629, 1630, which comes in your story fairly late. We, on the other hand, Ballais actually did have a lot of documents that have since been lost. You know, there's a moment, I think, in 17, 2, 3, 4, when all of a sudden, all of the documents that had existed up until that moment just disappeared, and we still haven't found them yet. So we really depend upon Ballais for those early years. But I think it's interesting, though, to put Ballais into a little bit of context. You began to do that by noting what it is that was going on in French politics at the time. But Ballais was engaged to do that by people who were working on what was to have been a complete edition of Descartes' writings that didn't come out, actually. And this was to be the sort of opening, part of it. Originally to have been written by one of the editors, Percellier, who had died without getting very far in the biography. They engaged Ballais, who was a professional writer and somebody who was much better at putting this material together. But of course, he had his agenda that was in part, I'm sure, partially dictated by the editors. Descartes was at that point under some attack from various corners, and this was intended in a certain way as a hagiography. And when you read it, you can see. Well, I did a course in the fall on basically the reception of Descartes later on in the 17th century, and it was really interesting. We read some of the primary materials for parts of Descartes' life where there were primary materials still, and there are a lot of later letters. But and then compared Ballais' account of it. And it's quite clear that there is an agenda. He does emphasize the nobility, and or at least Descartes' pretensions to nobility. And he does emphasize the connections with politics and political people and other famous people. And you've got to think that somehow or another that this is to convince the reader that Descartes was, really quite a substantial and important personage. And I have a personal wonder whether or not the extent to which that aspect of Ballais isn't perhaps pushing a particular perspective a little bit. There's absolutely no way that we can tell, because we don't have the materials that he was working with. And in fact, some of those early materials we only know because of his quotations, because of his paraphrases. But it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question to raise. And I think that the picture of Descartes sort of and his political involvements, I think the military stuff is definitely is trustworthy, but I wonder about the political, his involvement in the political
Yeah, one thing I think you're right to raise these questions about it, and one thing that helped me sort out a story, which I think is right, but probabilistic, is his friendship with Guise de Balzac, one of the few people from his early days who he wrote to later, and Guise de Balzac becomes a very important author and member of the Académie Française later on. And he is in trouble with Richelieu at the same point in time that Descartes goes to the Netherlands the second time, 1629. So I think that, and Balzac's family is very connected to many of the nobles around Marie de Medici and so on. So I think that some of those probabilities begin to emerge, again, from his associates and acquaintances. Many of his associates and acquaintances were not so socially well placed. And one thinks of some of his friends like Villebrosseau, who is an engineer like him, military engineer, and they spend a lot of time together. So, and he's not an eminent person, let's say. Descartes, it never quite makes it into the strata that I think he may have been looking to enter. But I think some of his friends suggest that Baillet is probably pulling out those sorts of things that would connect him to court and nobility in order to make Descartes' reputation exactly what you're saying, but that there are some connections there to be worked with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And he's not. There's certainly elements of Descartes' life that he has to work with there, but he may be sort of pressing those a little bit harder than, say, Villebrosseau or Isaac Beckmann, who is another very important character. For those who haven't read Hal's book, he is somebody who sort of eccentric enthusiast about mathematics and about Epicureanism and mathematical approaches to physics and so on, that Descartes became engaged with during these years, who was definitely not from what one might say the upper crust of Dutch society. But on the other hand, there was Constantijn Huygens,
right,
who was an enormously important person in Dutch politics at that time, not to mention a very important poet.
And I think just to leap ahead of the story that I've told as a young Descartes, later in life, when Descartes has troubles with the Utrecht controversy, Huygens and other important people help to protect him from real serious attempt on his papers, as well as his liberty as well. Yep. And that it was the Stadtholder Friedrich Hendrik who probably in the end protected him by getting the councils in Utrecht to back off.
Yep.
And besides Baillet, there is also Borel, and Hanoch wants to ask something about him.
Yeah.
And also Lipstorp, and in a way also Poisson.
Yes.
Let's
in
just
the 20th century, there are.
Say something about the years. Okay, Baillet is 30 years after Descartes' death, isn't it? Do we have something earlier than that?
Even more like 40 years.
40 years after Descartes' death.
And Borel writes in 56. I remember when I worked on my book, I wasn't interested generally in the biography of Descartes, but some periods, and he's in the meeting at the Nuncio in Paris in 1628, where he met with the Berulle. So because Baillet, as Dan says, is partly a hagiography, I checked with some effort Borel's account of that meeting, written when people who were actually there was still alive, so he should have been more cautious in that. But I don't have any idea whether Borel writes something about the earlier years in which Descartes joined the army and so on.
So all these early biographers mention his time in the war. One of them, I think maybe is Poisson, mentions that there was apparently an account of Descartes' time in arms, which has disappeared. But they're all very clear that he had this important military experience early in his life. Borel was, as you know better than me, no doubt, a military engineer also, and so very much in that tradition and would know it very well. So I think that the early biographers also are confirming the fact that he was interested in military and engineering kinds of activities, and that his reputation as a philosopher is acquired later in life, but that background is important. And so one of the things I just wanted to encourage people to do is think about how that early life might have affected his later philosophy. And that's where, not really being a Cartesian philosopher, I'm feeling a little bit out of place. And so it's up to people like Dan and others on the screen to tell me more about that. But I think the question about how to put his mind back in his body, you might say, is important.
I just wanted to say that we have 2 questions on YouTube exactly with the same subject. Yeah. So in what way all these early influences and life experiences have shaped the later philosopher? I can even press a bit harder and ask how does a military engineering and someone who looks for patronage in the fields of politics and war becomes a metaphysician in the first place? But maybe that's a bit too much to ask.
Well, so let me turn it over to all of you, but just make a couple of quick points. One is, I think that the agenda of the Epicureans was important during his early years. So there's a kind of materialist aspect to much of what he's doing, I think, that fits also with military engineering and mathematics. I think another another part where that comes out is his time in Italy. I think that's when Galileo is publishing the Assayer, and certainly the school of Padua may have been one of the places where his medical interests emerged very strongly. But in that medical world of Italy, well, there were many people accused of atheism, or at least leaning in that direction. So I think there were all kinds of important intellectual movements happening in Italy at the time that he is there, that he may be picking up on in later days, including the fact that some of his later medical advisors were trained in Padua as well, from the Netherlands. And the final thing to say is that the last book he publishes is on the passions. And I think, I wonder these days, especially with the current war in Ukraine, what people under fire think about. And I think those are moments when, the essences of life and questions about fate and destiny become really important to people. And his way of solving this was to investigate the passions coming out of the body. So it's a kind of explanation of how mind and body work together in the work on the passions. The work on the passions is one of the places that got me most interested in Descartes. And so I'll just leave it there. But I do think, I do wonder about how the military experience under fire, let's say, may also be affecting his view of how the world really works.
Dan?
This is actually one of the questions that I wanted to to address. You suggested, I think, a few moments ago, Hal, that it was only at a more mature age that Descartes began to work on his philosophy. And that's a point at which I think I may disagree with you.
Yep.
I think and he left school in 1614, 1615. He spent a year or two in studying law. That puts us up to about 1616. But as early as 1618, he is working with Beekman. He meets Beekman on November 10th, 1618, which is a very significant date for him. And Beekman is, of course, a mathematician, but if you look at the problems, this is a remarkable discovery that happened about 100 years ago when they discovered Beekman's notebooks. Beekman was an eccentric guy interested in all sorts of mathematics and what we would call mathematical physics. And he met this young guy, Descartes, and they immediately clicked. Of course, they did fall out later on, but they immediately clicked. And there are wonderful passages in the notebooks that record their discussions and problems that they worked on together. Like, for example, how to understand the free fall of bodies and things like that. Things about atomism, which were philosophy as opposed to just mathematics. Philosophy included natural philosophy. He's working on that in 1618. So he may have spent maybe a year or two in the field just doing military stuff, but pretty quickly he was back to what he thought of as philosophy. A year later, November 10th, 1619, was the famous Three Dreams, in which Descartes decides to rededicate himself to natural philosophy. And that in a certain way, and you have other papers, there are collections of remarks that Baillet makes reference to. For example, something called the Studio Boni Mentis, the study of, a sound mind, that indicate that he was thinking about philosophical stuff. Within a year or two, he is working on his treatise on method. And before he leaves for the Netherlands at the end of the 1620s, he has probably started his project that he called The World, and had probably sketched out an initial draft of his metaphysics. So during this entire period that you're talking about, I think he is certainly in the field. He is certainly engaged with political things. But at the same time, he is also, I think, beginning to work out his philosophical and what we would call scientific ideas. But of course, for him, they were also philosophical and mathematical. It's true he did not publish anything until 1637 with the Discourse on the Method and his scientific essays. But that has an explanation as well. When Galileo was condemned in 1632, as soon as he found out about it, he withdrew all of these projects from any idea of publication, and in fact said that he wasn't going to publish anything at all. That didn't last more than a few years. And so he did, it was only a little bit later that he actually drafted out what turned out to be his first philosophical and scientific publications. But the whole period was, I think, interleaved. And then there is the question that that was raised in the chat. How is it that you put together the philosophical and the scientific on the one hand, with the military and the political on the other hand? This would be a very interesting story if it were just, a smart, ambitious kid from the boondocks without any scientific philosophical interests and his sort of interesting minor career as a military architect and a soldier. But it isn't. It's Descartes, who was both. Even if you were to publish the story just as that, it would be sort of an interesting picture of a particular sort of person at that time. But what's interesting is he did then become René Descartes, and in a certain sense, the father of modern philosophy. And this does raise the question, how are these two parts of Descartes' personality and career connected with one another? And how does learning about his experiences both in the political world and in the military world illuminate the other part of his intellect, of his personality?
And there's a hand up, so let me just make a very brief response. Say I welcome all those comments. I think Dan's exactly right about this being a puzzle. And one quick response from me is simply to say there's lots of people like Descartes in terms of the class of people who are thinking about all these. Those philosophical conversations are happening throughout the upper levels of society, let's call it. And many of the people he meets in many, many places are having these conversations with him also, although they may come from different kinds of backgrounds, have a different kind of training. And so there's a kind of general conversation about philosophy, let's call it, the nature of life, in the middle of religious conflict as well, that he's involved in. And so many people are having those conversations. He is remarkable for what he does in exile, I think. And so once he has a time to kind of commit himself to sitting down and writing, he becomes Descartes. But until then, I think he's part of this very active kind of investigation happening among many, many people.
Well, I think he was even remarkable before he sat down, and wrote the final things that, if you look at his early work, his Le Monde, if you look at the rules for the direction of the mind, his methodological treatise, these are quite remarkable. And even if he had never published some of the later stuff, they still would have been, interesting and remarkable. But yeah, to put it in the context of the fact that he's not the only one who is thinking about these sorts of things. He is just doing it in perhaps a more interesting and more systematic and perhaps more successful way than some of the other people were doing, which is why it is that he was Descartes and not somebody who is forgotten.
Beckman, for instance.
Yeah.
Hanno has a hand raised.
Yes, thanks very much. All this is very interesting, and I'm learning a lot. First, one very small comment. We see in the discourse and method how he was Descartes disappointed with his studies, the scholastic studies. So this may explain why he thought of going and doing something different. But as Dan said, on 10/11, he meant Beckman, and he's back into mathematics and mathematical physics. He sees the possibility of mathematics and mathematical physics was something that the scholastics did not encourage in the way that Beckmann and all this more Platonist wave, Galileo as well. So this ignites his interest again, and he's in the army, but he has his dreams on turning mathematics and science around. But I actually wanted to make a suggestion, which the scholarly audience can either trash or perhaps contribute something constructive to. When we see Descartes' physiology, we see that he had knowledge in engineering. The body is a machine, a hydraulic machine, and he describes it in a way that shows that he's familiar with machinery. Now, people generally thought that this comes from his familiarity primarily with the hydraulic fountain machinery of the time. And we know that he read Salomon the Chaos. I wrote an entry on the Chaos for Dana's encyclopedia. And so certainly knowledge from these machines comes into his description of the human body. But perhaps given that he had background from military engineering, we can trace something of that in his description of the human body. It's a suggestion and question. I don't have anything specific in mind.
Maybe Bill Eaton has a question here that relates to this.
Yeah, as I was typing it, I was thinking the same thing. His study of anatomy might bridge the gap between Descartes, the military architect, and Descartes, the philosopher, since they're both studying mechanical structure.
Right, but still, let me just press you a bit. So Descartes goes to war in 1618 and meets with Beckmann, which you all say it's an important meeting in his life. It's an important interaction. He could have started doing some mathematics together with Beckmann, but he doesn't. He enrolls into the Catholic army and goes to fight the Transylvanian army in Hungary. And then he returns to Paris, and he's in the middle of the events. All sorts of interesting things are happening there in the 1625, 1628. He could have started writing or discussing or starting a philosophical career, but he doesn't. He disappears again, and he starts something else. So then how do you explain this philosophical work which goes on somewhere in his mind or maybe on paper as well, but it's always together with some implication into something else, which I don't know what it is. Hall's book suggests that he might have been involved in high politics, he might have been a spy. There is a big mystery around what are these interruptions in what we would say, okay, he got some ideas, he got some interesting interactions with other philosophers, now he's writing his treatises. But whether he was writing his treatises or not, that's a question, but meanwhile, he also did other things. So then what's your explanation? How do you put together these halves of Descartes, the man of the world, and Descartes, who was reconstructing modern philosophy at the same time?
Well, for me, I think that I don't want to take anything away from his brilliance or what became his approach to problems. As I said, I think that he's working in a world in which he's not the only person thinking about these things or having conversations about them. He's very, very good at it, but he's not a philosopher in the sense of teaching philosophy. He doesn't enter the church. He doesn't become a physician. So what other profession is there for doing what he does? He, in the later 1620s, one of the things apparently he was doing was exploring the possibility of becoming a royal official for the city of Châteauroux, which he decides against in the end because he wanted his father's permission, and apparently his father didn't give him blessings for that. But it is said he came back from Italy. The Italian part of his years, I think, is very important. But he comes back from Italy, he says, with having made money on his trip there. So he also says he's engaged in commerce, learning how to do commerce. Maybe he had in mind becoming a kind of purveyor to the army, as many people were beginning to do at that time. In any case, he apparently had enough money with a little bit of borrowing to buy the royal office, and yet he doesn't. He is, we know from later historians and antiquarians, his time studying law at Poitiers and his getting a law degree. Bayet doesn't mention it. Maybe Bayet didn't know it because he's keeping his law training secret. He never acts on it. He never becomes a lawyer like his brother does. So I think he is exploring possibilities and crossing some of those possibilities off as he sees the world around him. And no, I'm not really cut out for that. And so, I think that he's struggling to find a place in the world. And many times when he thinks that he has patronage looking forward, that he can become an important person working for the following person. Later on, it might be Princess Elizabeth, who does not go on to be a princess, but an abbess. So the high placed people he attaches himself to all end up falling. And so what is he to do? He ends up becoming a kind of a private person, which is very unusual for people in those days.
But since he had an income, right? The story has it that he had an income, so he didn't trouble himself. So why a patronage if he had such an income and could live well alone?
In the Netherlands,
his later years, of course.
Yeah, he has an income from an inheritance from his mother, and his mother's family had been what we would today call businessmen. They had been merchants and important members of Poitou, and he sells off lands and so on, and he has some, let's call it trust fund, something like that he can live off of, but live off of it modestly. And he does that very successfully in his later years. The question is, as a young person with ambition, what would you do? And selling out and living privately was a very unusual kind of decision for people in those days, rather than to keep trying to find patronage to go higher and higher. And as I mentioned, in the Netherlands, he attaches himself to the court around Friedrich Hendrik, and that includes most famously the Princess Elizabeth. And later he dies in Sweden with, at the court of Queen Christina. So he never quite gives up trying to make something more of himself. But he never accomplishes that jump into becoming a chancellor to somebody or chief advisor to some important person, I think.
Yeah, just add to that. I agree with that completely. He is looking for a role in life, and there isn't an obvious role as a philosopher,
right?
Or even as a mathematician. I think the very interesting parallel career is Galileo's.
Yeah,
Galileo actually was a professor for a while, but he was always struggling for money. You mentioned in your book the military compass that he invented. That was a way of making money. The telescope that he did not invent, but, figured out how to make, and, wrote a very successful book. The Starry Messenger was also in part a way of making some money, getting some status. Descartes, if you were a professional philosopher in a certain sense, what you did was you taught at a university. But that meant teaching whatever curriculum you were told to teach, which was, generally Aristotelian, not, of course, what Descartes wanted to do at all. That was not an option. Also, you had to be a priest, which he definitely did not want to do. So what do? And he did not have, enough status and enough money to be able to just sort of live the life of a nobleman. So he was sort of struggling to try to figure out where it is that he fit in. He went to law school, I think, because an uncle paid for it. And this is the family business. Renee, go to law school. I'll pay for it. And he did. And he promptly dropped it as soon as he possibly could. And you're right, it does not appear in Baillet. It does not appear in the Discourse on the Method, as in his own, anonymous autobiography. It was only, the details were only discovered. His thesis was only discovered about 20 years ago. It was a piece of scrap paper that had been used to as a backing for an engraving. And when the engraving was, this is actually at the Art Museum of the University of Poitiers, when the engraving was being restored, they took off the backing and out came this law thesis that had never been seen since Descartes probably left Poitiers, completely unknown. He was looking for something to do. And in the end, I think, through perhaps the encouragement of friends like Mersenne, who encouraged him in his work, he felt confident enough, I think, to be able to put aside, the work that he was doing with military architecture, concentrate on this, and figure out how to live on the inheritance that he had. But and make a, but you're right, Hal. It was not there was no obvious place for a sort of independent philosopher / mathematician in the world at that point. And he had to sort of make a place for himself.
But in a way, if you are putting it this way, okay, he was bidding for patronage and didn't succeed, and he was looking for other places and other kinds of life. But then it's very ironical that at the end, he ended his life in a most traditional place for a philosopher, as a counselor or professor or whatever to a queen.
Well, the reason, yeah, I don't think it's such a strange thing. First of all, by the way, I think he was never going to get any support from Princess Elizabeth. Her family was destitute at that point, and
yeah, let's talk a bit. I mean, who was Princess Elizabeth? Let's put some names and something.
Princess Elizabeth was, I think, the niece of Charles I of France.
Of England.
What?
England.
Of England, excuse me, of course. She was the niece of Charles I of England. Her father had been set up in Bohemia and overthrown, I think, within a year. He was called, I think, the Winter King, or the Winter Queen. Mother was
Winter Queen, yes.
Winter King, right. And they were in exile in the Netherlands while there was a civil war going on in England. And while Descartes was involved in correspondence with Elizabeth, which took place over, I think, the last 8 years of Descartes' life. For a long time, her uncle was beheaded, so they were, and there was also a certain amount of scandal that attached to the family as well. So Descartes was more of a benefit to her probably than she was him, although the prestige of being associated with royalty in a certain way made up for that. But on the other hand, one of the theses for why it is that Descartes went to Sweden, Descartes by that time had become quite famous in the 1640s. He had published the Meditations, the Discourse and the Essays, the Meditations, the Principles of Philosophy. He was extraordinarily controversial. There were fights in the lecture rooms about Cartesianism in Utrecht and in Leiden. But people were paying attention to him.
But meanwhile, he was kind of in hiding in Holland, isn't it? All this time, he became famous, but he didn't get involved personally.
Well, he tried not to get involved because when he did get involved, they took him to court. He got involved in court cases about whether or not his philosophy should be taught, and so on. So it was very controversial, but everybody was talking about it.
Just to add to what you're saying, briefly, if I may, just that he also makes sure that many of his works are published in French, and
Yes.
I think he's using many of the literary techniques that some of his literary friends, like Guy's de Balzac, are using.
Yes.
So he's writing his clear and simple ideas.
Yes.
Without footnotes, without condemning his enemies that he's really attacking, but you don't quite notice. You just read as if he is telling you what he thinks, and that's a way that is very appealing, and he really has an audience for his
No,
work.
absolutely. I mean, he writes short books that are intelligible, that people can read. I recently was made aware of the fact that virtually all of his works were available in Dutch, in Dutch translation, which is to say they were being read by people outside the universities.
Right.
And, as soon as they were being written. So,
yeah, he was writing for people like him.
Yep. Well, not as smart as him, maybe, but but he was writing for a wider public.
It's that class of people that I think he has in mind. People who came up the hard way like him, who are somewhere in these middle regions of society and are really interested in the nature of the world. And that's who he's writing for.
And everybody in France and Netherlands wanted to read about him. So he was, Elizabeth saw him as somebody who was enormously attractive to bring to Sweden to help her build a scientific community and a scientific organization. And I think that, the word was, or one hypothesis is that he needed the money, that his resources were running low. And so this was seen as, a good opportunity, which is why it is that he wound up, at the end in Sweden. Unfortunately, he got there and, within a short time, caught pneumonia and died.
Just to say, I see Hanok writing
Yeah,
something.
Hanok wants to introduce some
Because
notes to
I wanna
this
say
very nice
yes.
story, because this Descartes, who was writing popular novels about philosophy, popular philosophy books, was also writing something else. Hanok.
Yeah, so I don't know who exactly was his intended audience, but he certainly wanted to make his way into the universities. He writes his principles using as a model a scholastic text so that he can be taught at the universities. And he sends his book to his Jesuit teacher, Becket Laflèche, so to get his approval. And he writes to Mersenne that, if one Jesuit approves of it, everybody, all Jesuits do, because they are in such close connection. So he's certainly trying to get into the universities as well. And I have a question, because I've never studied his biography as a target in itself, but just to see, to serve other interests I had in it. But I remember I went to Franeker, which is the place he went to first when he moved to the Netherlands in 1628-9. It was the place with the second largest university then in the Netherlands. And there was an excellent mathematician there, I forgot his name now. And immediately upon
Matis.
Probably, I mean, I'm not sufficient, I trust you. And he immediately enrolls at the university there. And the university doesn't exist any longer. It closed down during the Napoleonic Wars because they didn't have enough students. So everybody went to war. But I saw an engraving of the city, including the castle, which Descartes rented when he arrived there. It was a Protestant place, but this castle was of the Catholic nobility, so it had a Catholic chapel where he could pray and so on. And it was a very large place in the print, actually. The city itself is roughly the same size as the castle with its area. So it seems that he had a decent income if he could afford this place.
Well, I think he didn't rent the whole place. He was lodging with the owners. Let's put it that way. Although, yeah, it's a beautiful spot on that map.
Yeah, I'm not, well, you know more than I do. I don't know whether they were there. So this was already during the or after the wars against. I'm not sure, but so if you're right, this explains how he could afford it. But yes, okay, thanks.
Can I just make a comment about Descartes and the universities? Yes, he certainly did have the ambition of having his doctrine taught particularly by the Jesuits, the Jesuits were, of course, the educators. They weren't the only educators, but their network of colleges were enormously important, and they were teaching uniformly, so that it came from the center in Rome, how it is that instruction was to be done, what they were to talk about, and so on. And he figured if he could convince the Jesuits to take his philosophy instead of Aristotle's, then it would be that would guarantee his success. He never had a chance. He never had a chance. The book that in the Principles of Philosophy, he does represent it. He does talk about it as if it were a textbook. But when you compare it with any of the textbooks that were available at that time, and this was an era of textbooks, it really isn't like anything else. It really is quite different. He had chosen a textbook that he really liked, in part because it was really simple and it didn't go into a lot of detail. This is Eustachius a Sancto Paulo. And he had originally planned to write the Principles as a sort of commentary on this Aristotelian textbook, but he abandoned that. It would have been unwieldy, I think. He abandoned that and then wrote the Principles, which is in a certain way like a textbook insofar as it's sort of short, concise paragraphs, sort of formal definitions of the main terms, something that doesn't presuppose, knowledge outside of itself. But it really looks very different from anything that.
But still, to come back to the question, what's the relationship between life and the work? Why would someone living on his private means in Holland write a textbook for a Jesuit college?
Ambition. He wanted to be successful. He wanted people to. He genuinely believed in what it is that he was writing and wanted it to be widespread.
I think,
yes, please.
So I was just going to say that many people were doing similar things. Sometimes these come out as novels or pieces of literature, but they're very often philosophically engaged. So I think the question for Descartes is not why he's interested in these problems of life, but why he decides that he needs to write in the simple way he does, but also giving natural philosophy the space that he gives it as an explanation. And yeah, so you think of other soldier philosophers like Cyrano de Bergerac, and I think that, there were many people around like Descartes, and he somehow managed to pull things together in his writing in such a way that he became the famous Descartes, of course, and all due respect to him for that. I'm not trying to quarrel with that at all, but just to say that he's working in this world of very well educated, striving, interested people. And the only profession you could have there would be something like medicine. And he didn't become a doctor either. I think engineering and medicine were the places where you could make your living doing natural philosophy of a certain kind among ordinary people. And otherwise, you would have to become a school teacher, as Dan is saying, or join one of the churches and become a minister. Many ministers are interested in these things as well, priests. So I don't, but there's a lot of these people around all over the place having these conversations about the meaning of life.
Well, I mean, there are many careers. While you were saying about his law school and how he had actually a degree in law, I was thinking of Francis Bacon in England, who practiced law all his life while doing philosophy. So that was one possible career. Then, of course, as you said, medicine was a possible career. Galileo's career as a professor and then moving to a court was another career. It's very difficult to think of any of these people as wanting to write a textbook for any kind of school, isn't it? Even Galileo, who was a professor, and he did write something for his courses, didn't make that an important purpose in his life. And his textbook on the sphere was just one textbook among the others. They were experiencing with different kind of writings. You were saying something about the Cyrano de Bergerac, who wrote a sort of novel and he became famous in his own way. Cannot imagine him writing a textbook.
No.
or dedicating his writings to the Sorbonne. So there is something mysterious about Descartes' policy of publication, politics of publication, isn't it?
Only to say that, to agree with you, but to say that maybe it would be worth thinking about the different kinds of genres that he's working in. Certainly, there is the textbook, and there is also Gideon Manning rediscovered a few years ago. The fact that he was under consideration for a position, Descartes, at one of the Italian universities as a professor of theoretical medicine in the 1630s. So he may have had some ambitions of becoming that sort of grand professor somewhere. But he's clearly interested in having these epistolary conversations with many other kinds of people as well.
I think no, as far as that was at the University of Bologna that Gideon Manning found that thing. The reason he never expressed any interest, I think, in the position. What they did discover, they couldn't find him, so he never got the offer. Who knows what he would have done had he actually gotten the offer? But there's a sense in which you're right, Donna, that nobody else that I can think of actually wrote a textbook or had the ambition of writing a textbook like Descartes did. But in a more general sense, I think being a university professor of philosophy meant teaching Aristotelianism in one form or another. That was the accepted philosophy, both in the Catholic and in the Protestant universities. Sometime in the 16th century, the Protestants in particular did experiment with other kinds of natural philosophies, but they came back pretty quickly to the Aristotelian. But virtually all of the new philosophers were interested in replacing Aristotelianism with something else. And that would have meant replacing it in the universities. They didn't necessarily want to be the people to write the textbooks that the students actually learned from, which Descartes, at least briefly, wanted to do. But Descartes certainly, but Descartes was not alone in wanting his philosophy to be the one that would become now the new standard philosophy that everybody would learn. But Descartes actually had a plan for how he was going to do it through the Jesuits. That obviously did not work at all.
Hanoch.
Another finger on this theme, I think when you see what Descartes writes, to whom he writes, how he writes, is much more calculative and deliberative, how to become influential compared to others like Galileo and later philosophers immediately following him. He publishes the discourse with the essays because he thinks this will give rise to interest in his also physical work. And he's really intent on having the Jesuits read the Meteorology, which contains the principles of his physics, because this way he can, despite the fact that he had to suppress everything, it would create a pressure on him to publish his physics. So he's deliberative in this way, with which I'm not familiar from people like Galileo a bit earlier, or other big or not that big names after him. So he is more calculative in how to get the this kind of recognition and pave his way into the intellectual. I have to leave also very soon, so I apologize.
And by the way, he was criticized for that.
Could I just say,
by whom?
Leibniz, for example, criticizes him, says, he just wants publicity. He wants his own school.
could I just say, though, in addition, to add to what I think Hanak is saying in the chat here about Wittgenstein. There's a new book called Wittgenstein's Artillery by James Clegg, and he's making the argument that Wittgenstein's experience as an artillery officer in the Austrian army during the First World War really focused his attention on things, and he uses many military metaphors later on about how to make a point or being out of your depth and so on. And so I think that there may be something in the focus of some of Descartes' work that you were referring to that comes from the kind of discipline that he acquired in his early life. He doesn't waste his time. He goes for the main point.
What strikes me when I'm reading, through Descartes' works, what always struck me was how diverse they are, in fact. Much more diverse than again, if you think of perhaps Galileo, or if you think perhaps of Bacon. Descartes was trying his hand on all sorts of genres and styles. Almost, Le Monde looks like some sort of a fiction, and then he was writing dialogues, and then he was writing prefaces to his Principles of Philosophy, which looks like letters. And then he wrote the Principles, which looks like a treatise, and then he wrote the Meditations, which looks like, I don't know what, you tell me. Why was he trying his hands in so many genres, which obviously seems to, obviously, I don't know, there is nothing obvious about Descartes, but they seem to be addressed to different kinds of public.
His work, L'Homme, is published posthumously, not during his lifetime. And I've thought about why he suppresses it, because I think it's suppressed during the Utrecht disputes. But you're right, he's trying many, many things. And one way of approaching this, I think, again, is to imagine the religious world of his moment. And he writes on the passions, which is a religious subject. He writes on generation and the creation of the world in a certain way. He writes on man. These are the big subjects for religious discourse, and he's giving a natural philosophy to them. So I think, that's why he's a dangerous figure here, as well as a popular one.
Now, meanwhile, he writes on how to perfect telescopes and how to grind lenses and how to calculate trajectories and what are the laws of collisions. Medicine, generation. So subjects are very diverse, but I went beyond the subjects into the kind of genres that he was kind of exercising his hands at then.
Well, some of it, not all of it. I think the Meditations and the Discourse on the Method are particularly interesting as genres. The Discourse on the Method is actually an anonymous autobiography, which is sort of interesting. It was published anonymously, but published as if it were an autobiography. The Meditations is a very odd form in which to present some of your philosophical works. There, I think he's dealing with an interesting philosophical problem, which is, on his view, to have real knowledge, you have to discover it yourself. You can't get knowledge by testimony, by reading what somebody else says. You have to really sort of absorb it, think through the arguments, be convinced by your own arguments. And both of those are different ways of communicating his views in a way that people will sort of absorb them as if they were theirs. That's obvious in the meditations, where you sort of enter into the persona of the meditator and think the meditator's thoughts, and then become convinced by thinking the meditator. Descartes is sort of guiding the reader to think the thoughts that will give them real knowledge. In the case of the Discourse on the Method, he says right at the beginning, I can't tell you what to believe, but let me show you what I believe, or how I came to have certain views about the world. And maybe you'll find some of it useful. Maybe this will sort of stimulate you to have your own thoughts and discover it for yourself. But then, of course, there's the Principles of Philosophy, which, by the way, he does describe how as teaching Le Monde to speak Latin. Le Monde was written in French, of course, originally, but he is gathering material from Le Monde and reformulating it, but in the form of a textbook. And if that isn't didactic, I don't know what is. So he obviously changes his mind there, but that's connected, I think, with the project. You know, Hannah points out in the chat, does he have a military strategy for how to break into the universities? In a certain sense, he does. He's thinking very, very careful for it. And you notice you made a reference to the letter that he sent to the Jesuits when he published the Discourse and Essays. That was presumably to his teacher there. We actually don't know exactly who it is, but we have a good conjecture of Father Noel. He begins by saying, hi, my name is René Descartes. I was in your class. You probably don't remember me, but everything I know, I learned from you, which is obviously a way of ingratiating himself into the Jesuits. Unfortunately, when you open up the Discourse, what do you read? You know, I went to school. I thought it was going to be the greatest experience of my life. And I discovered that they really didn't know anything. So I decided to leave it as soon as I could. And I can't imagine what Father Noel or whoever received the book thought, you know, having read that letter when he actually opened the book. So if it was a military strategy, perhaps it wasn't the most effective military strategy, but he was trying.
Can I just add that one of the person who translates the Meditations into French is the Duc de Luynes, who's the son of the Duchess de Chevreuse, who is married into the House of Lorraine. They're supporters of the Jansenists. I think that there is his military strategy, you might say, is, of course, he would love to convince the Jesuits, but I think he has an audience there. And the Duchess de Chevreuse is the most amazing woman of the French court of the early 17th century. She's involved in every plot imaginable, one of Richelieu's great enemies. I think my view is that Descartes is in the Netherlands because of a problem with Richelieu, who is trying to bring order to the French state, which includes a kind of intellectual order that is Aristotelian, in line with the Council of Trent and all that. And so he gets out. She is Richelieu's main enemy, and friends, very good friends with Queen Anne, who is later memorialized on the structure that's erected after Descartes' death in Stockholm. Her name is very prominent on that. So I think he has his patrons. They just don't quite openly support him by making him a counselor or somebody like that. But he has people who are listening to him in very important places, even if the Jesuits don't make him into a textbook.
It would be interesting, in that to continue a little bit. Had he not gotten sick and died in Sweden, to imagine, if he had lived maybe another 5 or 10 years, first of all, it would have been very interesting to see what he would have produced. But second of all, he might well have become a counselor at that point and entered court life.
So I just want to bring up one other thing, though, which is many of those people, like Queen Anne, the father of Louis XIV, and the Queen of France in his youth, Marie de Medici. These are people with very strong religious convictions, but they're not Aristotelians in terms of the doctrine. So they're not splitting hairs in a philosophical way, but they really are believers. And I think that that's what he's writing for from the heart. I don't think he's doing it simply to gain position in the world, but I think that there's something in his philosophy that is deeply in touch with a kind of spiritualist version of Catholicism at the time that's coming out of this experience. Many of you just recently, how he presents, you have to be convinced yourself because you feel it, right? You know it from your own heart. How do you tap into the source of being that we all possess in common? That's his project, kind of, and that's his audience. So that there's I think more than a philosophical audience here, there's a kind of spiritualist or believer audience that is trying to sort out the important things about life and how to live well in this world in a way that's faithful. Let's call it that. So it's a kind of secular philosophy, and yet it's oriented towards something very deep in the world based on experience that we all possess together, which is why I think his book on the passions is so interesting. But I think much of this is coming from that early experience with, the wars and patronage and things falling apart, and you just get on. And he knows.
Well, this sounds very convincing, and yet since I read recently Descartes' Dioptrics, I was shocked by the transhumanist project of Descartes' Dioptrics, about Descartes' claim that the eye is a telescope, the eye is an optical instrument, and just by setting some lenses in front of the eye, you can turn it into a better instrument. How much better? As much as you want. If you buy his machine for grinding lenses, and if you manage to grind hyperbolic lenses in a technological manner, then you basically transform the human eye from what it is naturally into an instrument of knowledge. How does that sound?
Yeah. So
in terms of a spiritual religion and the transformation of Catholicism, it's profound.
Well, so all I would say is it has to do with what is light and the movement of light and how. So I think that if we think of him as proposing matter in motion, like many people are doing, it's not just the matter but the motion that makes things happen. And where is the motion the direction of motion here? There's some kind of gravitational pull towards the center of being, maybe. I'm not a spiritualist myself, so I'm supposing things here, but I think that we are all instruments in a certain way in his propositions of something else, right? That we think of as our souls. And yeah, you tell me. But I think instrumentalism can fit that spiritualism quite well if you take a certain view of it.
I'm afraid I have to go.
Right.
Not because of anything you said, Hal, but
I think we should sort of wrap up. Dan, you have to go. Thank you for being with us. Grigore, I think, had something else to say. So Dan,
good night.
good night. Take care.
Thanks so
It
much,
was a
Dan.
great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Grigore, if you have anything to say, now is the moment because we are approaching the end.
If Descartes was thought to be the solitary philosopher who had to look within himself to find certainty and the project of the meditations, why do you think his life was so important, starting from the 17th century up to date? Why this proliferation of biographies of Descartes? In the last century, the 20th century, I think we have at least 7 biographies of Descartes, while for Leibniz or...
And more are coming out. I just saw that in 2023, there is a Stephen Nadler biography coming
Oh,
out.
yeah. Mhm.
For Leibniz, we have just 2 biographies. Why do we have so much biographies of Descartes?
It's a very good question. And I would only be speculating other than to say that he has a reputation for starting the modern world, philosophically speaking. But I think it's partly because of the range of his work, but also its approachability. And he can work out the details of optics and mathematics, and also about how to live well in the world, using the passions rather than suppressing them. And so, yeah, I think, yeah, it's a very wide-ranging and approachable set of thoughts about something that looks like a secular philosophy, but I think isn't quite that.
Or perhaps it's because of the many mysteries that we've been struggling with tonight.
That too.
That require, yeah, Descartes was always kind of a mysterious man. And I think that even his contemporaries were fascinated by this. And therefore, each biography was leaving questions unanswered and opened. And
Yeah, a kind of celebrity.
Take, for instance, the Rosicrucian event. Your books seems quite positive towards that hypothesis, right?
So, yes, I think, well, there's a question about whether the Rosicrucians were an organized group at all. But in terms of people writing about the Rosicrucians in that early 17th century period, many of their propositions, people associated with that movement, yeah, there's a lot in common with some of Descartes in those early days when he's in in Germany. I thought I should maybe mention a work in French on Descartes in Germany. I'm translating it into English by Edouard Mayle. And some of that, the Rosicrucian movement is Germanic. Kepler and others, people like that, are associated with some of the principles. There again, it's a kind of spiritualist, natural philosophy that's also, it's kind of spiritualism, but also materialistic and yeah, based upon substance and matter. Thinking about it in new ways, so it has a kind of alchemical flavor to it as well. So I think that is very much part of the range of issues, well, topics, subject matters, genres that Descartes was engaged with.
And you also say at some point that Descartes came very close to identify God with nature. Why do you say that? I mean, wasn't he so interested in having God transcendent to the world?
Yes. So now I'm on very dangerous theological grounds. But I think there is in Descartes a sense of matter in motion that is being so if we think of the way that our brains work, there's the spirits in our brain causing thoughts, let's say. So it's material stuff that's causing our thoughts. And yet there is a little bit of free will that we have. So those spirits can be pulled in various directions. And so I think that's a bit like the Holy Spirit or God for him, that there is a kind of gravitational pull towards something that is directing the motion in certain ways. I think that's why there is a certain kind of Jansenist appeal to this, an Augustinian view that is also part of his sense here. But there is in this the almost identification, not quite for Descartes, of God and nature that Spinoza picks up on. And Spinoza's first philosophical work is trying to write about Descartes. So I think that there's a possibility of moving in that direction here, even if Descartes doesn't do it fully himself.
Well, I think that we have many other questions, but 2 more minutes to go. Grigore, last question.
Well, I think that the book makes a quite strong connection between the young Descartes and the libertine culture of the days. Maybe a stronger connection than, for instance, Adam made or others. So maybe you could say a few words about that. How much of a libertine was the young Descartes?
So this is also a bit mysterious, so there's no definitive answer to this, but my impression from people that, again, he's in contact with, we know from in his youth, people like Guise de Balzac at one point in his own youth was clearly libertine. Libertinism often associated with philosophical Epicureanism, often brought out as atomism. Descartes, of course, isn't quite an atomist. He has his corpuscularian philosophy is a bit different, but nevertheless.
He has that entry, Democritica, in his notebook.
Sorry?
He has that entry, Democritica, in his note. He doesn't say Epicurea, but Democritica.
Yep. And some of the later people he works with are accusing him of being another
Christian,
Democritus. Yep. Or Epicurus, or even Pythagoras. So I think he's reaching in his own training and thinking about the origins of philosophy. He's not an Aristotelian. He's looking before Aristotle and moving even earlier than Plato. He's looking for the kind of pre-Socratic roots of philosophy, I think, and drawing on much of that work.
Yeah,
Thank you
more
all.
he speaks about atoms.
I think we have to wrap it up and call it a day. Thank you very much for this. I hope we have persuaded everyone that in case you believe you know anything about Descartes, I hope we persuaded you that you don't, as I am deeply persuaded that I don't. We are facing a deeply mysterious character who wrote all sorts of very different things that do not tie up together, despite all the efforts that later philosophers put into making Descartes a systematic philosopher. There is still to be learned about his life. There is still to be learned about his work and oeuvre and ideas and intellectual interactions. So I hope that the discussion tonight has whetted your appetite for reading more Descartes and also for reading Hans Koch's book, The Young Descartes, and many other biographies from the 17th, 18th, and 21st century. Thank you very much for tonight and have a good night. See you in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.